of terrorism is back as a big issue. And President Macron, in many ways, has been giving a lead on this. He is not one for mincing his words when it comes to dealing with Islamist terrorism. It's caused him some international problems with the Turks and with other parts of the Middle East as well. But he has taken a strong, clear line on this, even as there have been more attacks on the street. It is the subject of our Spectator magazine cover story this week. It's written by our associate editor, Douglas Murray. And Douglas, it's a great cover story. It's a great piece to go with it. But your main angle is that Mr. Macron is kind of on his own on this. The other Western leaders, they might agree with them, but they're just keeping their heads down.
Yes, that's right. We ran a piece in the Spectator last month immediately after Mr. Macron's speech. A lot of publications missed it. There's not been any shortage of news recently. But of course, we recognized the speech, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali wrote for us about what an important speech it was. Of course, those people who'd been criticizing President Macron for even making the speech ended up on the back foot only days afterwards when we saw the murder of Mr. Paty, the French schoolteacher. In the days and weeks since, we've seen a pattern of events which sadly, as you know, is not unfamiliar in France now. The fact that an attack that began with a French schoolteacher being killed for asserting secular French values was then followed up with an attack on 3 worshippers coming out of a church service is something, of course, that France has seen before, an attack on everything from the secular tradition to the right of freedom of worship. But what is so striking about it is 2 things. One, the attacks on the French Republic, not just on President Macron, but on the nature of the French Republic, from people vying in the international arena to be the effectively leader of the world's Muslims, but principally Prime Minister Imran Khan in Pakistan, but more significantly, the Turkish President Erdogan. That's the first most interesting thing. But the second most interesting thing, as you say, is the fact that the allies, the erstwhile allies, the closest allies of France seem to have been so silent on supporting their ally in this particular issue. You know, we have seen Justin Trudeau actually take a view that seems to suggest that there's some kind of moral equivalence. On the one hand, French secularism, on the other hand, tolerance and more. And so that's one type of reaction that's come. And the other has been effectively silence. Where is the German government when the French government and indeed state is being delegitimized across the world? Where is the British government? Where are the allies of France across our continent? And the answer to that seems to be absolutely nowhere.
President Macron has been remarkably robust. In the Brexit negotiations, his attitude towards fishing rights is one of the stumbling blocks. Did our own Prime Minister not miss an opportunity here? He could have stood 4 square with President Macron on this and almost implicitly embarrassed President Macron into backing off a bit on the fishing rights thing while doing the right thing, while our Prime Minister would have done the right thing to have stood by Mr. Macron. He missed that.
Yes, that's right. He absolutely missed the opportunity to assert our solidarity on the most fundamental level. I think, by the way, there are several explanations you could give. The first, most generous one is there's an awful lot going on at the moment in Downing Street, that they're simply unable, and this isn't by any means to let them off the hook, but simply unable to juggle the number of things that are coming on. That could be one explanation. But another, which I sense is going on internationally, is that France is coming under significant pressure. You know, there are large countries now, some of which I just mentioned, you know, calling for the usual things, boycotts of French goods, demonizing the whole state, not just the current government or the current president, but the whole foundation of the state in France. In that situation, it seems to me that there has arisen in our time a certain tendency of other European and Western states to try to duck the whirlwind. to sort of hope that the whirlwind passes over their house. We saw something similar in 2005 and 6 with the Danish cartoons controversy. Even other Scandinavian countries wanted to slightly step away from Denmark. They didn't want to be in the same boycotts as Denmark was already in. And I think this is an enormous shame and a missed opportunity, as well as a missed opportunity to assert a principle of solidarity across the free world.
I guess what I'm saying, Douglas, is that because the president has put the very soul of the republic at the heart of this, not saying that Muslims are in any way incompatible with the Republican French values, but the Islamist view of the world is definitely incompatible with it. That's a pretty big battle he's taking on there.
Yes, of course, he's not the first French leader to take on that battle. Emmanuel Valls, when he was prime minister recently in France, took on the same battle, asserted some of exactly the same principles that Mr. Macron has. What's interesting about it this time is that Macron appears to be acting and not just talking. A few weeks ago, Ayaan Hirsi Ali in the magazine was rightly skeptical about whether this would just be more words from the French president. But in the weeks since then, we have seen a number of actions. The withdrawal of the French ambassador to Turkey, quite rightly after the outrageous misrepresentation of the French president's remarks by President Erdogan in Turkey. Calls by the French for further strictures against the Turkish government, including being cast out of the trade cooperation agreements that it has with the EU. And then there has been other progressive developments, including the closure of the bank accounts, and indeed the banning of certain extremist groups in France. And then, most remarkably in some ways, the French president's call for, and indeed ordering of a doubling of French border forces. And then his assertion of two things in particular. One, he says that when he comes to the European Council meeting in December, he will be calling for, first of all, a rethink of the Schengen agreements, which allow the free movement, of course, of people across borders once they are in Europe. And secondly, a strengthening of the external borders. This must be on his mind in particular because of the fact that the attacker in Nice, who has been detained for killing 3 people outside the church, is a young Tunisian man who entered Europe in September through the Italian island of Lampedusa, which I reported from for the Spectator in 2015, 2016. For years, people have been able to tell European leaders and have said, if you have an entirely porous external border and free movement within the borders of Europe, this is a security nightmare that will keep on emerging. Now, previously, it has been principally Central European, Eastern European leaders who have made that point. In recent days, there's been another flare-up of tension between Chancellor Merkel and her counterpart in Austria, the Austrian Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, over exactly this issue. But to have that fight in the past tended to be a sort of East Europe versus West Europe point. To have Emmanuel Macron saying the same things that are being said in Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed in Mediterranean Europe, is a very significant development. And it leaves effectively Chancellor Merkel alone.
What do you say, final question, Douglas, to the more cynical point, which is it's just all politics, that the centre-right in France is on its back, the centre-left is in tears, the Socialist Party's not managed to rebuild itself, Mr. Mélenchon runs the left, he's never going to get very far. Mr. Macron has concluded that the only real threat to his re-election is Marine Le Pen, and he's moved his tanks onto her lawns.
There is a possibility. It's politics as usual. Of course, as you know, in the last presidential election in France, in some ways it was a sort of fluke, or at least a very small percentage chance that meant that that Macron and Le Pen went through as they did, because the vote was effectively split in quarters in France, and the calibration that Macron is making could just as easily, if it was totally cynical, go the other way in some ways. It's true he needs to take some of those Le Pen votes, but he needs to take votes from a number of directions. I myself think that, one can't read into the hearts of politicians. What we can do is judge their words and judge whether they act on their words. And that is what makes this particular episode unusual. It's not just been words, there are actually actions. Calling for diplomatic censure against the Turkish government for its outrageous calumnies against the French Republic is a stepping up. Actually closing groups, not just talking about closing groups that teach extremism and encourage extremism, but actually closing them is not just words, it's actions. So perhaps this is some kind of corner. I'm very skeptical, as you know, of the tendency to look for tipping points and inflection points. But in the long battle of the French Republic against Islamic extremism, what we're going through at the moment is definitely some form of progress.